The Galactic Concord had watched humanity for 300 years, and in all that time, they had never been impressed. Ambassador Kethvarin of the Silithine remembered the first reports about the strange bipedal creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. And he remembered how the senior diplomats had laughed at the primitive radio signals that leaked from that tiny blue world. They fight wars over skin color, one admiral had said with disgust. They poison their own air and water. Another had added, give them a century, and they will destroy themselves like so many others before them. That had been the official position of the Galactic Concord for generations, and nobody had seen any reason to change it because humanity seemed determined to prove every negative. Prediction correct. The Concord was vast beyond human imagination, and it stretched across 200,000 star systems and contained more than 200 different spacefaring species. And each of those species had earned their place. Through millennia of careful advancement and diplomatic patience, humanity had none of those qualities. And the observation reports made that very clear. Kethvarin stood in his private chamber aboard Station Vigilance, the massive orbital platform that served as the Concord's primary observation post for primitive species. And he read through the latest intelligence summary with his four eyes moving independently across the holographic display. The summary was troubling, and it had been troubling for exactly 42 standard years now. No signals detected from Sol System. The report stated in cold official language, sensor probes unable to penetrate unknown energy fields surrounding the system. Status of human civilization unknown. Recommendation: continue observation and await developments. Kethvarin made a sound that his species used to express frustration, and it was something between a hiss and a whistle that echoed through his empty chamber. 42 years of nothing, and the Concord leadership had done exactly what they always did when faced with uncertainty. They had waited and hoped the problem would solve itself. He remembered the day the silence had begun, and it had started without any warning at all. One moment, the observation stations had been receiving the usual flood of human communications, their entertainment broadcasts and their political arguments and their endless streams of music and information, and the next moment, there was nothing but a wall of impenetrable energy where the Sol System used to be. Some in the Concord had celebrated, and they had assumed that humanity had finally done what everyone expected and destroyed themselves in one final act of self-inflicted violence. Good riddance, the Vithrak ambassador had declared at the time, and his scales had shimmered with satisfaction. One less aggressive species to worry about. But Kethvarin had not celebrated, and neither had the other senior observers who had spent their careers studying primitive civilizations. They knew something that the politicians and admirals did not understand, and it was a simple truth that had been proven many times throughout galactic history. Species that destroyed themselves did not leave perfect energy barriers behind. They left debris fields and radiation signatures and the cold evidence of their failure floating through empty space. Whatever humanity had done, it was not suicide. The door to his chamber slid open, and his assistant Trelmac entered with the nervous energy that meant bad news was coming. Ambassador, Trelmac said, there's been a development. Kethvarin turned all four of his eyes toward his assistant, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. The field around Sol. Trelmac continued, it has dropped. For a moment, Kethvarin could not process what he had heard, and his mind simply refused to accept the implications. When? He asked. Approximately 1 standard hour ago. Trelmac replied, and Ambassador, there is more. Tell me. Something has emerged from the system, and it is moving toward Concord space at speeds we have never recorded before. A ship? We believe so, but the sensor readings make no sense. And the analysts are saying the data must be corrupted because nothing that size should be able to move that fast. Kethvarin moved toward the command center with a speed that surprised even himself. and his assistant struggled to keep pace as they rushed through the corridors of Station Vigilance. The command center was in chaos when they arrived, and dozens of analysts from a dozen different species were all talking at once while holographic displays flickered with impossible data. "Clear the main screen," HFY commanded, and his voice cut through the noise with the authority of someone who had spent centuries in diplomatic service. The screen cleared, and then it filled with an image that made every being in the room fall silent. The object was a ship, and that much was certain because it had the general shape of a vessel designed for space travel, but it was wrong in every way that mattered. The thing was massive beyond reason, and the scale indicator on the display showed a length of 17 kilometers from bow to stern. And HFY had to check the number 3 times before he could accept that it was accurate. Largest warships in the Concorde fleet were perhaps 2 kilometers long, and those were considered engineering marvels that pushed the limits of what was possible. This human vessel was not merely larger, it was a completely different category of existence. How? Someone whispered in the silence. How did they build this? Nobody had an answer. And HFY realized that nobody in the entire Galactic Concorde had ever considered this possibility. They had watched humanity struggle with chemical rockets and primitive space stations. They had laughed at the slow and clumsy vessels that humans had used to explore their own solar system. They had assumed that humanity was centuries away from faster-than-light travel, if they ever achieved it at all. And now this impossible monster of metal and power was crossing the void toward them at speeds that defied everything. The thing and this impossible monster of metal and power was impossible monster of metal and power was crossing the void toward them at speeds that defied everything. Concorde knew about physics. Catherine thought about all the reports he had read over the centuries. And he thought about all the times the Concorde had dismissed humanity as primitive and self-destructive, thought about the 40 years of silence, and he wondered what the humans had been doing behind that impenetrable barrier building. He realized they had been building, and now the galaxy was about to learn what humanity could create when it truly set its mind to the task. The cold feeling in his chest grew stronger. And for the first time in his very long life, Ambassador HFY of the Silithine felt something that his species had almost forgotten how to feel. He felt afraid. Nexus Prime was the heart of the Galactic Concorde, and it had stood as a symbol of unity and cooperation for more than 50,000 years. The station orbited a trinary star system where 3 suns danced in perfect gravitational harmony, and the light from those 3 stars bathed the massive constructed world in colors that no single star species could ever imagine. Billions of beings lived and worked on Nexus Prime, and thousands of ships from hundreds of different species passed through its space every single day. And the station itself was a marvel of engineering that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of carefully designed habitats and trade centers and diplomatic halls. Admiral Urix then of the Corthan Empire stood on the command bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical display with all 6 of his compound eyes. He had served in the Concorde defense fleet for more than 300 years, and he had faced pirates and raiders and even the occasional rogue species that thought it could challenge the established order. He had never faced anything like this. The human vessel had arrived at the edge of the Nexus Prime system approximately 2 hours ago, and in those 2 hours, every military commander in the Concorde had been summoned to an emergency council. 10,000 warships, his tactical officer reported, from 50 different species, all moving to intercept positions. And the human vessel, Urix then asked, it has stopped at the outer boundary of the system, and it appears to be waiting, Urix then thought. And he did not know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. The sensor data on the human ship was still coming in, and each new report was more disturbing than the last. The vessel, they had learned, it was called the Prometheus had armor plating that registered as denser than neutron star material, which should have been physically impossible. It carried energy signatures that dwarfed small stars, and the power readings suggested weapon systems that could crack planets with a single shot, and it moved with a grace and speed that nothing that massive should have been able to achieve. As if the laws of physics had simply decided to look the other way. "Open a communication channel," Eurixton commanded. And his voice was steady because a Korthan warrior did not show fear, even when fear was the only rational response. The channel opened, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a face appeared on the screen, and Eurixton felt something strange twist in his chest. The human was female, or at least that was what his cultural database suggested. And she had dark hair and dark eyes and skin the color of bronze. She was smiling, and there was something in that smile that Eurixton could not quite identify, something warm and calm and completely unafraid. "I am Captain Elena Vasquez of the United Nations starship Prometheus," the human said. And her voice was clear and confident and carried no trace of hostility. "We come in peace, and we would like to talk." Eurix then had prepared for threats and demands, and the kind of aggressive posturing that primitive species usually displayed when they first encountered the wider galaxy. He had not prepared for this. "I am Fleet Admiral Eurixton of the Concord Defense Fleet," he replied. "You have entered sovereign Concord space without authorization, and your vessel represents an unknown threat to the security of this system. I understand your concern," Captain Vasquez said, and she nodded slowly as if she genuinely did understand. "We did not mean to frighten anyone, and we apologize for the dramatic entrance, but we were not sure how else to get your attention." "You have our attention," Eurixton said. "Now explain yourself." "We would prefer to do that in person," the captain replied. "If you would allow us to send a small delegation to Nexus Prime, we would be happy to answer any questions the Concord might have. And if we refuse, then we will wait here until you change your mind. And we have plenty of patience." Eurixton looked at the tactical display, and he saw 10,000 warships surrounding a single vessel. And he knew with absolute certainty that those 10,000 ships could not stop the Prometheus if it decided to force its way through it. The human knew it too. And yet she was asking permission instead of demanding it. "One shuttle," Eurixton said finally. "No weapons, and no more than 10 individuals. And you will submit to security scanning before you are allowed to dock." "That sounds perfectly reasonable," Captain Vasquez said. And her smile grew slightly wider. "Thank you, Admiral. And I promise we will be on our best behavior." The communication channel closed, and Eurixton stood in silence for a long moment while his officers waited for orders. "Maintain defensive positions," he said at last, "and keep all weapons powered, but do not fire unless fired upon. And if they attack," his tactical officer asked, "then we die," Eurixton replied simply. "But I do not think they will attack." "How can you be certain?" Eurixton thought about the smile on Captain Vasquez's face, and he thought about the way she had asked permission when she could have simply taken what she wanted. "Because if they wanted us dead," he said, "we would already be dead, and they would not have bothered to say hello first." The shuttle that emerged from the Prometheus was small and sleek, and it moved toward Nexus Prime with the kind of casual ease that suggested its pilot could have outflown anything the Pides Concord put in its path when it docked at the diplomatic port. Security teams from a dozen different species were waiting with weapons drawn and scanners ready. The hatch opened, and Captain Elena Vasquez stepped out with her hands visible and empty, and she looked around at the armed soldiers with an expression that suggested mild amusement rather than concern. "Good afternoon," she said in perfect Concord standard, a language she should not have known. "I hope we have not kept you waiting too long." Behind her came 9 other humans, all dressed in simple uniforms without any visible weapons. And each of them moved with the quiet confidence of people who had absolutely nothing to fear. The security scans found nothing dangerous. And the humans were escorted to the main diplomatic chamber where representatives from every major Concord species had gathered to witness this historic moment. Ambassador Keth Vorn watched from his position among the Silithine delegation, and he studied the human captain with all four of his eyes. She moved through the chamber with grace and respect, and she greeted each species according to their own cultural customs. And she showed no discomfort at the strange appearances and stranger mannerisms of the beings around her. "She knows us," Keth Vorn whispered to his assistant. "She knows all of us." "That is impossible," Trollmac replied. "We never made contact with them." "No," Keth Vorn agreed, "but it seems they made contact with us." In their own way, Captain Vasquez reached the central speaking platform, and she turned to face the assembled representatives of the Galactic Concord. "Thank you for receiving us," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the vast chamber. "Humanity has watched the stars for a very long time, and we have dreamed of this moment for generations. We have come here today, not as conquerors or supplicants, but as neighbors who wish to introduce themselves. We know that our arrival has caused concern, and we know that our ship has frightened many of you, and for that we are truly sorry, but we hope that in time, you will understand why we built what we built, and why we waited so long to reveal ourselves. We are ready to answer your questions, and we are ready to begin a new chapter in the history of both our peoples." She smiled again, and Keth Vorn saw something in that smile that he had not expected to find. He saw hope, and for the first time since the silence had begun 40 years ago, he wondered if perhaps humanity had not been building weapons. Perhaps they had been building a bridge. The negotiations had been going on for 3 days, and Ambassador Keth Vorn had not slept in any of that time. Sleep seemed pointless when history was being written in front of his eyes, and every hour brought new revelations about the species that the Concord had dismissed as primitive for so long. The humans were polite and patient and endlessly reasonable, and they answered every question with honesty and clarity, and they never once showed any sign of arrogance or superiority, despite the impossible warship that still hung at the edge of the system like a silent reminder of their true power. Keth Vorn had been assigned to the diplomatic delegation that worked directly with Captain Vasquez, and in those 3 days he had learned more about humanity than 3 centuries of observation had ever revealed. "You knew about us," he said to her during a brief recess between formal sessions. "You knew everything about us before you ever left your system." Captain Vasquez nodded, and there was no shame or embarrassment in her expression. "We listened," she said simply. "For a very long time we listened. But how?" Keth Vorn pressed. "Our communications are encrypted, and our languages are complex, and there should have been no way for you to understand what you were hearing." "Ambassador," Vasquez replied with a gentle smile, "humans are very good at listening when we want to be, and we are even better at solving puzzles that interest us. We spent decades studying your transmissions, and we learned your languages, and we pieced together your histories and your politics and your cultures from the fragments that leaked across the void. We know about the Concord's founding, and we know about the wars that came before, and we know about the delicate balance of power that keeps your alliance together. We know about the Vithrak Dominion and their long history of intimidation, and we know about the smaller species that live in fear of their larger neighbors. We know that the galaxy is not the peaceful utopia that the Concord pretends it to be." Keth Vorn felt a chill run through his body, and it was not a pleasant sensation. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because honesty is the only foundation for real friendship," Vasquez answered. "And we want to be friends, not just allies. We could have hidden what we knew, and we could have pretended to be ignorant newcomers stumbling into your galactic community, but that would have been a lie. And lies have a way of destroying relationships eventually. So we choose truth instead. Even when truth is uncomfortable, Kethvorin considered her words, and he found himself believing them despite all of his diplomatic training telling him to be cautious. There was something about this human woman that made deception seem almost impossible, and he wondered if that was a gift common to her species or something unique to her. Before he could respond, the doors to the negotiation chamber opened, and Ambassador Vrektal of the Vithrak Dominion entered with his usual escort of armed guards and diplomatic assistants. Vithrak were large reptilian beings covered in dark green scales, and they had dominated Concord politics through military strength and economic pressure for thousands of years. Every species in the Alliance knew that the Vithrak considered themselves the true rulers of the galaxy, and they tolerated the Concord only because it was more convenient than open conquest. Rectal moved to the speaking platform without waiting for permission, and his guards took positions around the room that were clearly meant to intimidate. "Enough of this theater," he declared, and his voice was a deep rumble that echoed through the chamber. "We have entertained these primitives for 3 days, and it is time for the truth. You will surrender your vessel for inspection," he said, pointing one clawed finger at Captain Vasquez, "and you will provide complete technical specifications for all of your weapon systems. You will accept Vithrak observers on your homeworld, and you will submit to the standard protocols for integrating new species into the Concord hierarchy. These are not requests." The chamber fell silent, and every eye turned to Captain Vasquez. She did not look frightened, and she did not look angry, and she simply stood with her hands folded in front of her and regarded the Vithrak ambassador with an expression of mild curiosity. "I appreciate your directness," she said after a moment, "and I understand that the Dominion has certain expectations about how these situations should proceed. However, I must respectfully decline your demands. The Prometheus is humanity's ship, and it will remain under human control. Our technical specifications are our own concern, and they will not be shared without our consent, and our homeworld welcomes guests, but it does not accept overseers." Rectal's scales darkened with anger, and his guards shifted their weapons into more aggressive positions. "You are one ship," he growled, "and we are an empire of 10,000 worlds. Do you truly believe that you can refuse the Dominion and face no consequences?" Captain Vasquez tilted her head slightly, and something changed in her expression, something subtle but unmistakable. "I think there may be a misunderstanding about the Prometheus," she said quietly. "Oh," Rectal replied with contempt. "She is not our only ship," Vasquez continued, "and she is not even our largest." The silence that followed was absolute, and Kethvorin could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "You lie," Rectal said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I do not," Vasquez replied simply. "Humanity spent 40 years behind our barrier, and we did not waste a single day. The Prometheus is impressive, I know, and she is the pride of our fleet, but she is just one of many. And if the Dominion truly wishes to test our resolve, they will discover that we have more than enough strength to defend ourselves." She paused, and her eyes met Rectal's without flinching. "However," she continued, "we did not come here to threaten anyone, and we did not build our fleet to conquer or destroy. We built it so that we would never have to kneel. We built it so that we could stand before the galaxy as equals and not as servants. And we are offering that equality to you now, not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to choose peace instead of war. The choice of how you respond is yours." Rectal stared at her for a long moment, and Kethvorin could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The Vithrak had built their power on fear and intimidation, and they had never faced an opponent who could not be bullied into submission. They did not know how to handle someone who was simply not afraid finally. Rektal turned and left the chamber without another word, and his guards followed in confused silence. Zoran let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and he looked at Captain Vasquez with new understanding. "That was very dangerous," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But sometimes the most dangerous thing is to show weakness when strength is required. The Vithrak understand power, and they needed to know that we have it. What happens next is up to them." Kethvoran nodded slowly, and he thought about all the years he had spent watching humanity from afar and assuming that they were nothing special he had been wrong. And he suspected that the entire Galactic Concord had been wrong in ways they were only beginning to understand. These humans were not primitive at all. They were simply patient, and patience, he was learning, to be the most terrifying weapon of all. The Vithrak battle group arrived at the Nexus Prime system 2 days after Ambassador Rektal stormed out of the negotiation chamber, and everyone who witnessed it understood immediately that this was not a coincidence. 300 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, and each of those ships was a predator designed for one purpose: the destruction of anything that stood. In the Vithrak Dominion's Wayfleet Admiral Urixthin watched the tactical display with a growing sense of dread, and he knew that he was witnessing either the beginning of a war or the end of one. "They are moving toward the Prometheus," his tactical officer reported, "and they are broadcasting a demand for the human vessel to power down all systems and submit to boarding." "Have the humans responded?" Urixthin asked. "Yes, Admiral, and Captain Vasquez has issued a single message." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Please reconsider.'" Rixton closed his compound eyes for a moment, and he thought about what was about to happen. The Vithrak did not reconsider, and everyone in the galaxy knew that fact. They had built their empire on the principle that backing down was the same as dying, and they would rather be destroyed than show weakness. The battle group continued its approach, and the Vithrak commander broadcast another message demanding immediate compliance. The Prometheus did not respond. "Admiral," his tactical officer said with growing alarm, "the Vithrak are charging weapons. Order all Concord vessels to pull back," Rixton commanded, "and activate all sensor arrays to maximum resolution. Sir, whatever happens next, the galaxy needs to see it, and we need to record every detail." The Concord fleet retreated to a safe distance, and thousands of sensor arrays turned toward the confrontation that was about to unfold. The first Vithrak ship fired. The plasma bolt was a streak of brilliant green that crossed the void at near light speed, and it struck the Prometheus directly on its forward armor. Nothing happened. Bolt splashed against the human vessel's hull and dissipated harmlessly, and the Prometheus did not even seem to notice that it had been attacked. The Vithrak responded the way they always responded to resistance, with overwhelming force. 300 ships opened fire simultaneously, and the space around the Prometheus became a storm of plasma and missiles and kinetic projectiles that would have vaporized any other vessel in the galaxy. The Prometheus absorbed it all, every shot, every missile, every weapon the Vithrak possessed struck the human ship and vanished without leaving a mark. And then the Prometheus Mavadirixthin had seen fast ships before, and he had witnessed maneuvers that pushed the limits of physics. But he had never seen anything like what the human vessel did in that moment. The Prometheus accelerated from a standing stop to speeds that should have been impossible, and it dove directly into the heart of the Vithrak formation with a grace that made his soul ache. It did not fire a single weapon. Instead, it danced the ship weave between Vithrak vessels with centimeters to spare, and each time it passed close to an enemy ship, something happened that Urixthin's sensors could barely comprehend. The Prometheus was generating gravitational fields as it moved, not weapons, just fields, and those fields disrupted every system they touched. Vithrak ships went dark as their power cores overloaded from the Gravitational shear weapon systems failed as targeting computers, lost their ability to process. Data engines stuttered and died as the fundamental. Forces that held matter together were temporarily scrambled in 11 minutes. It was over 300 Vithrak warships drifted helplessly in space. Their crews alive and unharmed, but completely unable to resist. Not a single Vithrak had been killed. Not a single human weapon had been fired. The Prometheus came to a stop in the center of the disabled fleet. And for a long moment, nothing happened. Then every communication system in the galaxy activated simultaneously. And Captain Elena Vasquez's face appeared on screens across 10,000 worlds. "People of the Galactic Concord," she said. And her voice was calm and steady and carried no trace of triumph or anger. "I apologize for this demonstration. We did not want to fight. And we did not want to prove our strength through violence. But it seems that some of you needed to see what we are capable of before you would believe that we are serious. So let me be clear. 40 years ago, humanity looked at the stars and saw a galaxy that would never accept us. We saw empires built on fear and alliances held together by intimidation. We saw species that had been bullied into silence and worlds that had been conquered without ever being invaded. We could have despaired. And we could have surrendered to the reality of a universe that seemed designed to crush anyone who was not strong enough to fight back. Instead, we built, we learned, we prepared. Not for conquest, we have no interest in your worlds. Not for revenge, we hold no grudges against those who dismissed us as primitives. We prepared for this moment, the moment when we could stand before you and say, we are not your prey. We are not your servants. We are not another species to be ranked and categorized and assigned a place in someone else's hierarchy. We are your neighbors, and we would very much like to be your friends. But friendship cannot be forced, and it cannot be demanded, and it cannot be taken by the strong from the weak. Friendship can only be offered and accepted freely. So that is what we are doing now. We are offering friendship to every species that wants it. We are offering protection to every world that needs it. We are offering a new way forward, not a concord built on fear, but a community built on respect and cooperation and the simple belief that every intelligent being deserves to live without terror. The Vithrak ships behind me will be released unharmed, and their crews will return home with a message for their leaders. Humanity does not want war, but if war comes to us, we will end it, and we will win. The choice of what happens next is yours. Choose wisely. The transmission ended, and the galaxy fell silent. Erix then stood on his command bridge and stared at the tactical display. And he realized that everything he thought he knew about the universe had just been proven wrong. The Vithrak had been the apex predators of the galaxy for 10,000 years. And they had just been defeated in 11 minutes by a single ship that never fired a shot. He thought about what that meant. And he thought about all the species that had lived in fear for so long. He thought about the worlds that had been bullied and the peoples that had been silenced, and he felt something strange bloom in his chest, something he had not felt in a very long time. It was hope, and looking at the faces of his crew, he knew he was not the only one across the galaxy. Billions of beings watched the recording of what had happened, and they saw something they had never expected to see. They saw a species that was strong enough to destroy, and chose not to. They saw power that could have been used for conquest being offered for protection instead. They saw humanity, and for the first time, they understood the galaxy had gone silent. But it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a universe holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. The weeks that followed the demonstration were unlike anything the Galactic Concord had ever experienced. And Ambassador Kethvorin found himself at the center of changes that would reshape the galaxy forever. Vithrak Dominion's political coalition collapsed within days of their fleet's defeat, and species that had spent millennia living in fear suddenly found the courage to speak with voices they had almost forgotten they possessed. Trade agreements that had been forced through intimidation were renegotiated, and alliances that had been maintained by threat were dissolved, and the entire structure of galactic power shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. Devoran watched. It all happened from his position on the diplomatic council, and he found himself thinking constantly about the humans and their impossible choice. They could have conquered, and they could have ruled, and they could have built an empire that would have lasted for 1,000,000 years instead. They had offered friendship. It made no sense to him, and he needed to understand. He requested a private meeting with Captain Vasquez, and she agreed without hesitation. And they sat together in a quiet chamber overlooking the endless stars. Why? He asked. Because that single word contained everything he needed to know. Why what? She replied with a slight smile. Why all of this? Cathoran said, gesturing at the window and the galaxy beyond. You could have made us kneel, and you could have taken everything you wanted, and no one could have stopped you. Instead, you ask for trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and you offer protection without demanding payment. It does not make sense. Captain Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. Do you know how many wars humanity has fought against itself? She asked. No, Cathoran admitted. Neither do we, she said, because there have been too many to count. We have slaughtered each other over land and resources and ideas and skin color and which god we prayed to, and 1,000 other reasons that seem ridiculous when you look back at them. We have built empires that stretched across continents, and we have watched those empires crumble into dust. And we have repeated the same mistakes over and over again, and every single time, we told ourselves that this time it would be different. This time we would be the ones in charge. And this time we would be fair and just and wise. It was never true. Power corrupts. Ambassador, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we have learned that lesson so many times that it is written into our bones. She turned to face him, and her dark eyes held a weight that made Cathoran feel very small. When we looked at the galaxy, she continued, we saw ourselves. We saw empires built on fear and maintained by violence. We saw the strong crushing the weak and calling it order. We saw everything that we had done wrong, playing out on a scale we could barely comprehend. And we had a choice. We could have joined that system, and we could have become another predator in a galaxy full of predators. And we would have been very good at it because violence is something humans understand better than almost anything else. Or we could try something different. We could build strength, not to dominate, but to protect. We could become powerful, not to conquer, but to ensure that we would never have to. We could offer the galaxy something it had never seen before, a species that was strong enough to take everything and wise enough to take nothing. It was a choice, she said simply, and we chose to be better than we had been. Cathoran considered her words, and he felt something shift inside him, some old assumption crumbling to dust. And if someone forces your hand, he asked quietly, what then? Then we will defend ourselves, Vasquez replied. And we will win. But we will never fire first. We will never conquer. We will never rule. That is not who we chose to be, she smiled then. And it was a sad smile full of the weight of history. We are not good beings. Ambassador, and we never have been. We are capable of terrible things. And our past is full of horrors that would make your species weep. But we are also capable of change. We are capable of looking at ourselves honestly and deciding that we do not like what we see. We are capable of choosing to be different, even when being different is harder than being the same. That is what we offer the galaxy, not perfection, but the possibility of growth, not dominance, but partnership. not fear, but hope. Kethvorin extended his manipulator limna. Silithine gesture of respect between equals. Vasquez took it without hesitation, and her grip was warm and strong and steady. I think, Kethvorin said slowly, that I am beginning to understand your species. And I think, Vasquez replied, that we are going to be very good friends in the months that followed. The Galactic Concord transformed in ways that had seemed impossible before humanity's arrival. New treaties were signed based on mutual benefit rather than intimidation. New alliances formed between species that had been enemies for thousands of years. New voices joined the galactic conversation. Species that had been silenced for so long that they had forgotten they had anything to say, and through it all, humanity remained true to their word. They traded fairly and shared freely, and they protected those who asked for protection without demanding anything in return. They did not try to lead, and they did not try to control, and they seemed content to simply be one voice among many in a chorus that grew more harmonious with each passing day. Kethvorin thought often about the old reports he had read during his centuries of observation. He thought about the species that had been dismissed as primitive and self-destructive, thought about all the assumptions that had been so terribly wrong, and he realized that the Concord's greatest mistake had not been underestimating human technology. Their greatest mistake had been underestimating human wisdom. Humanity had not built the Prometheus because they wanted to conquer. They had built it because they understood something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. True strength was not measured by what you could take, it was measured by what you chose not to, and in the end, that simple truth changed everything. The galaxy had gone silent when the Prometheus arrived, and it had stayed silent through the demonstration and the negotiations and the long process of transformation. But gradually, the silence began to fill with something new. It filled with voices that had been quiet for too long. It filled with ideas that had been suppressed for centuries. It filled with laughter and music and the endless conversation of beings who had finally learned that they did not have to be afraid. The galaxy had gone silent, but it would not stay silent forever. And when it spoke again, it would speak of hope. The humans had a word for what they had created, a word from one of their ancient languages that had carried them through the darkest times of their history. They called it dawn. And looking out at the stars from the observation deck of Nexus Prime, Ambassador Kethvorin finally understood why the long night was over and a new day had begun.